if your holy book endorses and justifies slavery and you try to defend it, then you obviously understand that there's some issues with the morality of your book. Like, I mean, pretty much every single Christian tries to defend slavery in the Bible, and there's obviously no way around it.
If thou buy a Hebrew servant, 6 years shall he serve, and in the 7th he shall go out free for nothing. So that's obviously a commentary on the limitation of something like indentured servitude.
Yeah, but that's only the beginning. You gotta wait until a few more verses down in order to get a full context of what they're talking about.
Perhaps we could call it slavery, and so there's a freedom that's extended to the slave who would have been indentured in one.
We can call it slavery, and there's freedom given to the slaves. I mean, if you're a slave, you don't really have any kind of freedom.
Manner or another. I'm going to go through the laws here, and anyone who wants to chime in and comment.
Well, just for this one, it's important because it's related to the Sabbath. It's like an implication of the Sabbath, which is that if you take a servant, someone becomes your property, for 6 years they will work, and then the 7th year they are set free. And so it's this.
Yeah. He used the word property, and he's totally okay with defining people in that way. Property. He's not disgusted that people were being treated as property. He's trying to defend it, and he's totally okay with it.
It's a structure that you find in the Sabbath, also in the Jubilee. There are different structures of how we kind of restore things so that we wouldn't have generations of Hebrew slaves bound to one family forever, and so you would create this destructuring thing within the people.
But the Bible did allow for generations of Hebrew slavery. If the master gave the slave a wife and they had kids, and he wanted to stay with his wife and kids, he could become a permanent slave to the slave owner. And permanent slaves weren't just, Hebrews, but, you could have foreigners that were permanent slaves that could be passed down to your kin.
But it imitates the rhythm of creation.
That's right.
Is the point.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And it's
a magnificent contrast to the other nations, who all have classes
that are permanent.
Whereas here, no permanent slaves and no unequal permanent classes.
Right.
Wow, it's funny how they're talking about that there were no permanent slaves just because of this one verse, and then once they get to the other verses where they will talk about permanent slaves, they kind of just ignore that.
We should make a point here that the natural condition of human society is class distinction that are relatively permanent as the upper classes can make them, we might say, and slave ownership, and so that any movement in the direction of the freeing of the slaves is a revolutionary movement. But having said that, how do you reconcile the fact that God is the spirit that leads people out of tyranny in the broader book of Exodus, but there's still...
God supposedly leads people out of tyranny, yet he has rules that allow for one person to enslave another for various reasons. You got verses in the Bible that allow for people to sell their daughters into sex slavery, to buy foreigners and Hebrew slaves, how to make them into permanent slaves, when you can buy people who you can enslave during war and stuff like that. So no, God doesn't bring people out of tyranny. That's just another falsehood of the Bible.
Still allowance made, for example, in this verse for the existence of slavery per se.
Yeah. Well, the thing about slavery is that it's very difficult for us to understand what ancient slavery was, because we have safety nets, we have all these things which make it possible for people to exist. But in a world where you have someone who can become in such a dire situation that they're basically, dying of hunger in the street.
Okay, So why are these people in such a situation when you have an all-powerful, all-knowing God that supposedly cares about everybody? Couldn't he do something so that people weren't forced to become slaves to others, or make rules to where you can enslave others? He could have said, "Thou shalt not enslave others," and then when he saw people that were in dire need, he could have provided for them. I mean, he's all-powerful. That would be easy.
Giving, selling yourself or placing yourself under the authority of someone else was a way in which to continue this, to actually preserve the social fabric. And so it's like, I can't do it. I just can't. I'm not. So I propose myself to someone. I say, I want to enter into your service. You take care of me. I work for you. And then after 6 years, then hopefully I'm set on a path that I can now continue.
It's like a mortgage on yourself. And
as you pointed out, it is indentured servitude, and I don't know the statistic. I wish I did by heart, but more than half.
I wonder how many indentured servants were allowed to be beaten until near death, and then only the slave owner being punished if you died. If you recovered in 3 days, well, slave owner was fine because you're his property. That is not really indentured servitude right there. That is slavery.
Of the earliest settlers of America came as indentured servants. So that's how common it is. It was a way actually of uplifting your life, as you both have pointed out. And the other thing worth noting is the word for slave in Hebrew, eved, is very complex because does it mean servant? Does it mean slave? For example, Moses is described as Eved Adonai, the Eved of God. Is he God's slave? Nobody thought so. Yet the Jews or the Hebrews, Israelites in Egypt are Avadim, plural of Eved. So they were slaves. So the Torah, I guess almost unfortunately, uses the same word for servant as for slave.
Well, one of the things.
So God couldn't give the Hebrew Israelites like two different words for two different things, but instead had to give them the same word for two different things so that people in the future will have this mass confusion about what they're talking about. That's a really good way of getting your message across. Thank you, God.
We need to understand about words in general is that as they move through time, they become more specific. So if you chase a word back in time, it has a broader and broader and broader and broader range of application. It contains more concepts that would be differentiated in modern society. So it's harder for us to understand what the word might mean.
But you remember earlier in Exodus, you free them that they might serve the Lord.
Yeah,
in other words, the principle is, Bob Dylan.
You free them, you free people from slavery, so that you can then enslave them and become your own slaves. Because if you actually look at the Bible, they are pretty okay, and there's lots of talks in the Bible about how you are a slave to God, and there is only one master, and that is God. So Christians really have no issue with slavery, being that God is definitely okay with it.
You got to serve somebody.
Right. So there's,
But this service, we have a prayer in the Anglican service book, your service is perfect freedom. And that's Moses, the servant of the Lord.
Your service is perfect freedom. So in order to have perfect freedom, you have to be a slave to God. That is what that is saying, which is pretty wild. Because that is not freedom whatsoever. Slavery is not freedom.
I should point out, too, that we're welcoming Douglas Headley to the table today. He hasn't been here for the last 2 episodes, but he's come today and should be sitting in for the rest of the seminar. So welcome, Douglas. We're extremely happy to have you back with us. So, okay, I'd like to point out that we've got through one whole law so far. And so we'll go to 21.3. Which is an extension of the same proposition. So this is a limitation on indentured servitude. If he came in by himself, he shall go out by himself. If he were married, then his wife shall go out with him. If his master have given him a wife, and she have borne him sons or daughters, the wife and her children shall be her master's, and he shall go out by himself. So that enables him to...
Okay, so that means that if you are enslaved by yourself and your master gives you somebody to marry and you have kids and you fall in love with the person and you love your kids, you can become a permanent slave. That was a loophole for people to use to get permanent slaves, as well as to increase their roster of slaves by forcing people to breed. This was true evil right here, and this is something endorsed by quote-unquote God. It's something in the Bible, and it's something that is accepted.
Take with him what he has accrued to himself, I presume.
It's something to take that he accrued himself. The slave owner didn't accrue this himself. The baby was created by the parents, not the slave owner. This is just seeing human beings as property, and you would think an all-loving being wouldn't allow his chosen people to be treating each other as property.
And if the servant shall plainly say, I love my master, my wife, and my children, I will not go out free, then his master shall bring him unto the judges. He shall also bring him to the door or unto the doorpost.
Okay, forgive me. So this is...
Why did you have to interrupt? Yeah, okay, so if the person says, I don't want to leave, the slave owner takes some and pierces their ear to show that they are a permanent slave to that person, and can then be passed down as inheritance to their children, making that person and their family slaves permanently for life.
Critical. There is an obvious implication that not everybody will pick up on. If the slave says, I love my master, so people will think, what kind of kook is that?
This is something like right-wingers and like hardcore slave-supporting Christians always want to try to get at, where slaves supposedly love their masters, or they were occasionally good slaves. So why is it wrong for people to be in slavery when you had good slaves providing them homes and education and stuff? But that doesn't justify anything. You're still treating people as property and forcing them to do labor against their will. So, I mean, it's just wild how Christians try to justify slavery at like all turns whatsoever, when everybody knows slavery is inherently immoral.
A slave who loves his master, but it's not a master in the sense that we think of like the transatlantic slave trade or ill treatment in South America, etc. This is again what we said earlier, indentured servitude, and it is possible he loved his master. What if he treated him well?
What if? I mean, yeah. The master could have, given him the best education, the best food, the best clothing, the best house. But the fact that this person was still considered property to somebody else means that there is a societal injustice going on, and that society and those people aren't good whatsoever. When you have people treating other people as property, your society is fucked.
And he has his needs taken care of, and he doesn't want to leave his wife and children. So it implies, if nothing else, the possibility that there were good people or decent people in the role of quote-unquote master.
Okay, so what if these masters end up deciding to, beat their slaves every other month because they were angry, or they weren't working hard enough? Are they still good masters? What is supposed to happen to the people that consider the masters to be bad masters? Should they be able to rebel and change the system of slavery? Because I doubt he thinks that should happen. All he cares about is the hypothetical, oh, some slave masters were good even though they treated people as property, so slavery is okay. It is highly fucked up that there's still so many people today that believe slavery is okay.
And this enables the person to continue that service even though in some manner he's condemned to be free by the essentially by the Sabbath lifting of the indenture servitude
But
requirement.
there is a subtlety here that the if he comes in with his wife, he goes free with his wife in the 7th year. But if the master gives him his wife and he bears children, the wife and children stay.
Right.
So this is whatever we may think of that.
Property differentiation.
Yes, this is
It's a breeding program. He is kidnapping women, forcing them to breed with men, and then whenever he's done with the men, making them leave and bringing in another man to breed with the woman. And a lot of these people were getting women by going to war. If you read the Old Testament, there's a lot of verses where the Hebrew Israelites go and commit genocide against other cities and kidnap children in order to use as a breeding stock. And Christians act like this is something good when it's not good whatsoever. It is the raping and enslaving of children, and they pretend they care about children while believing these kinds of stories.
a way of his being able to freely stay with what he has been part of building. But it doesn't simply go with him because of this distinction in the law between whether you were given it or whether you brought it with you.
Right. It's difficult when you're explicating a text as ancient as this to understand exactly what parts you would require to be permanently applicable and what parts have to be differentiated so they were laws that were germane and relevant to a time and place.
Wow, okay. That's just like how Christians say some parts of the Bible is a metaphor and some of the parts of the Bible is literal. Oh, what parts of the Bible do we have to see as just, a story? And what parts of the Bible do we have to see as applicable to these people? Blah, blah, blah. It's just a way to say, oh, well, here are some of the really bad parts. I don't like them, so they're just metaphors. Here are some of the good parts. I like them, so that's the parts we should follow or listen to.
And so it's very difficult for modern people to understand anything like the morality of this set of rules because all of the conditions under which these rules were generated are so different from our conditions. But it's also hard, I guess, for people who are claiming something like the divinity of the biblical text to also say, well, this doesn't apply because it only applied to that time and place. And so,
but what the text? I mean, first of all, there's a
Yeah, it's funny how Christians act like certain parts of the Bible only applied to certain time periods when God says He's everlasting and unchanging and all His rules apply forever. And anyone who changes an iota of the law will be punished with hell. So, the Old Testament laws still apply, and Jesus trying to change the laws means that he should be punished with hellfire for trying to change the laws of God, even though he is quote-unquote God, but he's also quote-unquote a human, which Christians still can't decide on if Jesus was God or not, which, he wasn't. He was just another miracle worker, just like Hannah Mendoza, Apollonius of Diana, and all the thousands of wonder workers back in that time. No different than street magicians that we see nowadays.
huge distinction that might be good to make now. This God is everybody's God. First one to say so. And
Everybody's God. That's some BS right there, because he is not my God. I have no gods whatsoever. And even during the time that the Hebrew Israelites created the Judaic God, and the time when Jesus was alive, there were still many other gods around, and people worship different gods. So you can claim this one God is everybody's God, but that doesn't make it fact whatsoever.
And he gives a law in great detail. We're going through it. It's not everybody's law. It's the Jewish law, right? And Christians think that later God will say, my kingdom is not of this world. And that means he doesn't give us laws like this. And that's...
My kingdom is not of this world? What does it mean? Like, your kingdom is in some other world, so it's non-existent whatsoever? Because if something is not of this world, then that means it doesn't exist whatsoever.
It's an enormous change. And see, if in Islam, God is a universal God and a lawgiver. And that means the one who interprets the law has got supreme authority. It's hard to think what check there is on it.
Well, that's kind of like Catholicism as well, since, well, Islam was influenced by Catholicism, Christianity, and, various other religions, just like how Christianity was influenced by Judaism and various other religions. Judaism was influenced by the religions of the past. All religions have been influenced by other religions, even though they want to pretend that they're separate entities. That is always far from the case whatsoever. No matter what they claim, you can always see some type of influence. Just like with Moses. The Moses character was heavily influenced by the Egyptian religion, which is why he created the Ark of the Covenant, which is an Egyptian item that they would usually make. If I remember correctly, it was a type of sarcophagus where they would put dead people, or at least the bones, or possibly some type of artifacts. I can't remember right off the bat.
In both Judaism and Christianity, it isn't like that. These laws are as strict and detailed as any in the ancient world, but they're just for this people. And there's a structure, by the way, of rule. This is a polity. We're founding a polity here, right? And they can be analyzed against each other according to Aristotle's categories for one. And this polity has a structure of authority that it's not absolute monarchy. It's in the beginning, it's hardly monarchy at all. And there's priests and rulers, and they offset each other. And this law is a law over them too. And so it's a very curious thing, and it gives.
I mean, you can't really have a monarchy or any kind of like true governmental system when your authority figure is a fictional being that makes all the rules. Like, it's like how North Korea has a necrocracy where the true ruler is a dead dude. It's like, how are you gonna talk to this person and get any kind of ideas from, or laws from, or anything like that when they're dead or don't exist? It's the person who is actually in office at the moment that is making up all the rules, and they're just claiming to get the information from said person or being, like Moses getting high off of the holy anointing oil, which was created from cannabis oil. All he did was get high and then made a bunch of claims, and these dumb people were like, oh yeah, this dude who's high off of drugs, yeah, he makes a lot of sense, we're gonna follow him.
Fuel and credence to the Christian view that this is a preparation for God to rule all the earth.
Mm-hmm. That's right. We can see in the particularity of the laws the seeds of a universal understanding of all humanity, because what's different from the codes that came before is that we don't have, it's not just an abolition of distinctions among classes, it's very clear that there is no longer any category of human being that is, as it were, enslaved, that servitude is sort of part of what it is to be that category of human being.
Well, no, even in the Old Testament, they talk about, I mean, not the Old Testament, but the New Testament, they talk about slavery. Paul talks about, servants servants or slaves obeying their masters. There's only one good master, and that's the master in heaven. If you're a good slave, you're going to go to heaven, even if your, master is bad or whatever, and that Christians are slaves to Jesus and God. So, slavery is like one big old, okay thing for Christians, which is pretty wild, because it's just insanity to be okay with being considered property to a fictional being. Christians are even okay with, God murdering people, because if you're like, hey, look at this part of the Bible. God did this, and this to people, and that is, horrible. And they're like, oh, well, God created people, so he can do whatever he wants to people. Which just means that we are just God's playthings. And they're totally okay with that. And it's just wild. Why would you be okay with just being a toy to somebody?
And so we should see it really, I think, in developmental terms. We're seeing what we need to do is compare with what went before, and we need to understand the kind of trajectory of the moral universe of Israel towards the universalism that we find later on.
There's a phenomenon that Egyptologists described as the democratization of Osiris and Horus. And so the pharaoh in Egypt was conceptualized as the union of Osiris and Horus. So Osiris was the god of the state, who could become willfully blind to the machinations of evil, who was once great in his youth, but who developed this ossification across time. That's the problem of tradition. And then Horus is the visionary revitalizer who journeys to the underworld and revitalizes the father. And the Egyptians conceptualized the pharaoh, the sovereignty of the pharaoh, as the union of Osiris and Osiris. So it's the union of tradition and vision. And then to begin with,
yeah, the Egyptians weren't unknown to combine the ideas of masculine and feminine, or aspects of a goddess and a god together, and treating it like one. The idea of like trans people and stuff were, not unknown to those people, or the LGBTQ community, which was why it was shown in their gods and goddesses as well.
Only the pharaoh could use the symbolism that was associated with Osiris and Horus, but then the aristocracy began to pick it up, and they call that the democratization of Osiris. And you can think of what happened among the Jews as an extension of that. It's a spreading down of the idea of sovereignty and intrinsic value itself.